So I'm here with Assistant Professor Joel Christensen of the University of Texas at San Antonio, who's a classicist but works in the Department of Philosophy.
Philosophy and Classics.
Okay, Philosophy and Classics. Okay, Joel, so do you want to tell us what you work on?
Well, I work primarily on Homer. I guess I'm broadly trained in classics, and I teach pretty widely, but I've been, I guess, a self-identified Homerist since I entered graduate school.
And what about Homer?
My work primarily is on, or my dissertation work and graduate work was primarily on language in Homer. And I think my interests continue to be broadly concerned with language in many different ways. So my original interest was in whether or not there was an internal concept of rhetoric or effective persuasion inside the Homeric epics.
So not just the use of rhetoric, but a self-conscious awareness of it operating.
Right, and how it should be used.
Okay.
Right. So my dissertation is a fairly long study of that, and I'm still sort of working on, completing that research in different ways. So I'm interested in the power that language has and the political impact language has as it's portrayed among the Achaeans, the Trojans, and the gods.
Do you think you can give us a couple of examples of that?
Sure. I think one of the best ways to talk about it is to think about it in contrast, right? So as you know, because you work on this too, people used to say that there wasn't really anything political about the Iliad and the Odyssey until Dean Hammer came along and made a really strong case. But with a lot of considerations of politics in the Iliad and the way language works, they sort of really just look at Trojans and Achaeans. But if you look at the Trojans, the gods, and the Achaeans, you can see that language is manipulated and used in various ways. One way you can look at it is not the specific use of different lines itself, but let's say language context.
Okay.
So the Achaeans reflect what seems to be the case from archaic Greece, where they have a clearly demarcated assembly, where they use language in one way. So, for instance, language in the assembly is broadly poetic and more persuasive and less participative than it is in the smaller context of the council.
Okay.
Right. So one way.
It's more. So maybe in debate, it's more performative.
It's definitely more performative, but it's rhetorical in the modern sense, where it's really just for show.
Okay.
So to contrast that in an interesting way with the Trojans, if you look in Book 7 of the Iliad, there's an interesting case where there are a couple councils right together. And when they call the assembly among the Trojans, the language is used in a really weird way to really defer dissent of any type. So one of the Trojans, Idaeus, suggests giving back Helen, and Paris strongly refuses that. His father, Priam, comes up with what looks like a compromise, but it's really just a way of smoothing things over.
Rubber stamping his son's position.
In a different way, the Trojans, it seems, really come to some sort of plan and plan making in the council, and you can see where that's important in Book 9 of the Iliad. Right, where they have this big assembly, and Diomedes says, "Oh, I'm going to fight with you, Agamemnon."
Yeah.
And Nestor says, "Well, hold on there a minute." And then they go to the council, where Nestor actually takes Diomedes' advice and says, "Agamemnon, you screwed up."
But you don't do that in the public.
You don't do that in public.
I see.
And so what's interesting then is that among the gods, there's no true assembly speech. Right. It's almost always council speech in nature. And if you actually look at some lines and the diction, this becomes pretty clear.
And this is because of Zeus?
Yeah, and this is because of Zeus. And so part of my interest is in the way in which the political organizations in these cities influence the way that language is used and the way that rhetoric is deployed.
Correct.
On the other side of that, I'm interested in language less, let's say, broadly and more specifically. So I have interest in historical linguistics, but also in the way that Homeric language is put together. So one of the things that an article I just finished is on first-person futures in Homer. So I'm interested in the way that the future itself wasn't completely formed at the beginning of the formation of the Homeric dialect. And so you get a lot of strange uses for the future.
Okay.
So for instance, there are some uses of the future where when, let's see if I can get this right, when Menelaus and Helen are giving gifts to Telemachus in the Odyssey, they say, I will give you the gift at the moment that they're giving it.
Yeah.
Right? So one of my questions is, why do you say you will do something that you're doing? Or in book 15 of the Iliad, Zeus says to Hera, I will threaten you, at the moment that he's threatening her.
Right.
So this always interested me in the way that future tense works. Have we misunderstood it?
Right.
And there's a pretty interesting book by Jill Wilmot called Homeric Moods, where she argues persuasively that the future is really something of an old modal form. That there's no real future in early Greek. There's no, let's say, morphology that's clearly marked out for the future. And so in early Greek, there's confusion between subjunctive uses, operative uses, and future uses.
And the subjunctive and future are often close together.
Yeah, and they overlap. So I argue in this paper that certain uses, in certain cases, the future is what we call performative. That the Homeric Greek speakers will use it to assert that they're doing something. And in cases, like in the case of giving or embedding, the future can be used to affect an action itself.
It's a speech act. It's like, I wake you.
Exactly. And so that, and this leads into some interesting uses later in Pindar and choral poetry, where the future is used, where they actually identify the performant future. At the end of famous Homeric hymns, where they say, I will sing, or at the beginning they say, I will sing as they are singing. It's sort of an authoritative way of announcing, let's say, a marked speech act.
That's really interesting.
So those my interest then in Homer broadly, but I'm also interested in some different directions.
Okay, do you want to tell us a little bit where they might be going?
I'm sort of a science fiction geek.
It's true, you got me into Battlestar Galactica.
That is, I've only watched each episode 3 or 4 times. It's not too bad. But I've always been fascinated by, I think, the scope that science fiction takes on, the human, let's say the human condition. I think I was really influenced at a young age by authors like Isaac Asimov and Frank Herbert, who seem to always be emphasizing that we don't really think long term, that we get so caught up in the individual moment. So one of the things that I'm interested in, that I'm working on a paper for, and just gave a talk at the APA about, is about how this complex sense of time sort of unites the narrative stances of Homer's Iliad and Frank Herbert's Dune.
Okay.
So the way in which they create this important narrative moment, so what I call the synchronic moment, the story time, the narrative time, that is dependent upon rather long range visions. And so one of the interesting things is that science fiction replaces religion, magic, and let's say ritual in epic with science, with quasi-science. So for instance, we have prophecy and epic, and we have in Dune the main character Paul has prescience, right? So he can actually see in the future because he's been bred to do it.
Right.
So I'm interested in the way that this use of this consciousness of time reflects on the narrative traditions themselves, and in fact what the relationship between science fiction and epic may be, and the way that reflects on the nature of storytelling and their various stances towards the heroic tradition.
So there are different tropes within these two genres, epic and science fiction, but the way that they're conceiving of narrative and putting narrative together, especially the kind of the time space aspect, they're doing it in similar ways.
Yeah, they're doing similar ways. They use different tools,
yeah,
right? And because the form of the genre is different, it may not be immediately recognizable.
Yeah.
But there's real homology there in the stance that the two texts take towards.
Well, for me, I mean, since you got me into Battlestar Galactica, I mean, I've got to have an excuse for them watching it. And for me, I was really struck by how this particular example of science fiction, rather like epic, rather like tragedy, in fact, it explored issues that are very relevant for us. But in a sense that it's because it's some other time, some other place, it allows us to look.
And that's exactly what's going on. I mean, anthropologists and literary theorists have written about science fiction since at least the 60s as a genre that creates what they call a second world.
Yeah.
Right? And so what I see, again, this common ground in the narrative stances is that epic projects upon a fantastic past, right? To explore the very real concerns of the audience's present. Right?
And this gets us back nicely, I think, to the politics of
right,
the
exactly.
you're talking about.
And science fiction similarly. Because we can't change our past anymore because we believe in history and we divide between fact and fiction in various harmful ways. Instead, we look forward to this mythologized future, right? And so even since the golden day of science fiction, even before, H.G. Wells, there's always been this idea that we can explore issues that are dangerous now by projecting them onto, this myth of the future, right? So, sometimes when I teach a class on myth and science fiction, I talk about the time machine. Wells spends so much time worrying about the plight of the worker and class warfare. I think for modern American students, this smacks too much of communism. And it's frightening. But Marx is right there, and he's concerned, and this sort of dominates his narrative. And it's hard, I think, for me to put myself in, let's say, the shoes of someone in England in the 19th century. But I think science fiction has always fulfilled this cultural function that myth and epic used to be able to.
Yeah, the classic example for me, again, is picking up on Battlestar Galactica, is the opening of season 3, where you have a scenario of occupation,
right,
and you've got suicide bombing, and this is playing in prime time American television, and yet it's obviously it's not the enemy, the other who are the suicide bombers who are being...
It's the people you're supposed to empathize.
It's the people you're empathizing.
And if you didn't watch the webisodes working up to that, you don't expect it at all, which is sort of what's brilliant.
Yeah.
And that show, again, it really shows how you can surprise the way you think about real cultural issues. For instance, I don't know if you remember the episode, I think it's season 2, where President Roslin decides to ban abortions.
Right.
Because there's no human race left.
Yeah.
And if people are aborting children because they're worried about them, we're not going to survive. And again, I think the writers are very clever. They're assuming, I think, in their in their mind's eye, their audience is going to be rather liberal, and will, if not be pro-choice, will be on the fence. And I'm a pretty liberal person. I found myself in that episode deeply conflicted.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
it's getting you to look at issues that you couldn't normally look at.
And I think and that's something that science fiction can do. Ronald Moore, who created the show, has said that he created the beginning, that first episode where Caprica is destroyed, the colonies are destroyed, after thinking of September 11th. Right. And when I first saw the show, I was living in New York. I had been there during September 11th. It didn't occur to me.
Yeah.
But after thinking about it, I realized that maybe that the emotional resonance that had with me may not have been there, and may not have been with many of my friends who lived in New York, if not for our own experiences. And if we think back, and we use this as a parallel for thinking with epic and tragedy, and the very real experiences that Greeks were having with war. And we tend to put the Iliad and the Odyssey. You and I tend to put the Iliad and Odyssey a little later in its in their completions. And I definitely think if you think of a time where there is civil conflict throughout individual cities, where there's constant war between the cities, and where Greeks are consistently contemplating war with others, the Persians, barbarians to the north, you can see how the Iliad would really resonate with those concerns. How powerful it is. And as our one-time teacher, Erod Malkin, writes, with thinking about the Odyssey for the experience of colonization. There's the epics, and I think this is one of the interests we have in common. The epics at the same time are a product and a producer.
They're foundational narratives, aren't they? They're explaining where we come from.
And I think that's that those different, all of those commonalities between myth, ancient epic and science fiction, really draw my attention, because I see in both of them something that really reflects an essential facet of human nature, which is that we're essentially narrative machines, right? And what I find really important and powerful is studying the fact that the stories we tell inform the way we evaluate our own lives. Right? The stories we tell and the stories we listen to condition the way that we make decisions, and also condition the stories we tell about ourselves. And so I think that there's, no matter what happens with the humanities, or no matter what happens to us, thinking about storytelling, studying storytelling is important, because at one level it's essentially studying what it means to be a human.
Joel, thank you very much for taking us on your story and how important Battlestar Galactica is to understanding ancient epic. I think so anyway.
Maybe next time we can talk about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Right?
Actually, we have someone at the OU who loves Buffy, so I should introduce you to.
Okay, you should.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.